Well, good morning and good afternoon, depending on your time zone. And my name is Robert Schulhammer. I'm from ADB's European Representative Office. And thank you very much for joining us today for this discussion on our development effectiveness review from 2020. And I think it's probably a bit of an understatement to say that 2020 was quite an unusual year. I think even for a region which is very acquainted and used to dealing with natural catastrophes and pandemics and financial crises, I think 2020 was really rather extraordinary. And so this particular DEFR, the acronym for the effectiveness report, is one which I think, how should I say, it is particularly special. So thank you again for joining. We're going to go through, we have about an hour, and I'm joined by my colleagues from our results management and aid effectiveness division, who prepared this report. We also have the great pleasure of having two highly knowledgeable panelist discussants, Per Basto, who recently retired from NORAD as head of evaluation in Norway, and also Annalisa Prison, who's joining us from the Overseas Development Institute, and is really, as many of you will know, a great authority on IFIs and in ADB. I think the debate, is particularly important because I think, as you will know, ADB as part of the MDB and IFI system is really part of the core architecture for working not just on crisis response and pandemics, but also in addressing some of the key issues that the Asia-Pacific region and the world face, whether it's climate change or gender, education, and so forth. So there are many different issues, I think, which ADB has had to wrestle with over the last year. How do we help effectively our developing member countries deal with COVID on top of, or how should I say, together with providing an effective response on some of these longer-term global and regional issues. So maybe I think the majority of people here today, I think, will know ADB quite well. But if you permit, I'll just run through 3 very quick slides to give a very brief introduction as to what ADB is and what we do, to give a bit of context for those who might not know. So if we could move, please, to the first slide, and then I'll introduce our colleagues from our results division. We'll then proceed to to our distinguished discussants, and then we'll open to Q&A. We'd very much like, of course, to make this as interactive as possible. So please feel free to, at any time, to submit a question in the Zoom function, the question field. And of course, we'd very much welcome your live interventions as well. So please just indicate in that field whether you'd like to make an intervention. I think one of the, it's a pity that we can't be having this in person, where it's a bit easier with putting flags on tables and things, but for the time being, I think we're making do with this virtual format. So if I can give just a very brief introduction to ADB, who we are. 50 years ago, we were established dealing mostly with mostly a poor region. Over time, we've grown to have 68 members, of which we have 17 in Europe, which is the bailiwick of the European Representative Office. Our total capital is around $150 billion, of which over 20 billion is held by these European members. I think one thing I found in this particular position, it's a very little known fact that Europeans have such a huge stake in this institution focused on Asia and the Pacific. I think it's even higher than the European stake at the EBRD. What do we actually do? We're a very project-focused bank. The portfolio we have currently of both private and public operations is around $100 billion. And we work in roughly 40 developing member countries, which stretch in quite a vast arc all the way from Georgia and Armenia all the way through to Nauru and Kiribati, with most countries in between. We used to be primarily, and still are primarily, a sovereign bank, but the balance is changing. So under one roof, we have both public and private sector operations, and also support public-private partnerships. Again, the concept, keep this all under one roof so we can do these things effectively. We have about 3,500 staff. We're based in Manila, and we have field offices in pretty much all of our developing member countries, and also representative offices in the developed countries. If we could move to the next slide, please. So No coincidence that our strategy 2030 is aligned with the SDGs. The big changes that came through were, you might see on the right-hand side, we want to expand the private sector operations, greater focus on catalyzing and mobilizing finance for development, including the private sector, and a bigger focus on knowledge as well as just the finance, combining the two. So, and from a bank which was very much focused on poverty, the strategy 2030, I think the biggest change there, it recognizes that most of our developing member countries are now middle income. So their aspirations are more to achieve prosperity. At the same time, inclusivity, major challenge in Asia, resilience, not least with these pandemics and catastrophes and financial crises coming along periodically, and sustainability, of course, a huge issue in such a rapidly growing region, which often came at a cost to the environment and which goes beyond Asia and the Pacific. So the final slide here I'm going to talk about is the differentiated approach that ADB takes. Of course, not everybody is an upper middle income country. You still have fragile conflict affected situations. Afghanistan comes to mind, parts of Myanmar, small island developing states where you might have a high GDP, but major development issues often related to climate change or governance. Low income, middle income countries have different needs. But I think one thing that united pretty much all of these in 2020, there was that massive impact from COVID. Asia, of course, dealt with the first SARS, the first SARS outbreak, and I think learned a lot of those lessons. And looking back then, I think we coped very well in managing a normal portfolio, a normal program, while also helping along on the health front. This COVID-19 has been of a different scale and has vast ramifications and continues to do to this date. And I think this is what makes this particular effectiveness review so very relevant. So if I could turn to, please, to our first speaker from our results division, I'll use the acronym SBRA. The team leader is Miss Lindsay Renaud, who will present the first part. Lindsay is results specialist from our aid effectiveness and results management department. She's the actual one who led this important work, and her role in the bank is to support developing member countries and ADB staff to actually use the results management in their daily work. She has a background from the Caribbean Development Bank at a Canadian consulting company, as well as in international nonprofit organizations. And she joins us today from Oviedo in Spain. So Lindsay, please, over to you.
Great, thank you, Robert. So we're going to share a little bit first on the background actually behind this review before we move into the main findings. So I'll turn it over to my colleague Lou first to share about our corporate results framework.
Thank you, Lindsay, and hope everybody can hear me okay. As Robert has just described to you, Strategy 2030 is a really important document for ADB in that it guides us towards our goals. But what is really also important to us is to understand how we're doing in terms of achieving these goals. This is in fact why we developed the corporate results framework to comprehensively measure and monitor our progress. The current corporate results framework covers actually 6 years from 2019 to 2024. And as you can see on the slide, it is divided into 4 levels. Each level has both results framework indicators, RFI, and tracking indicators, TI. So as some of you know, ADB is high on acronyms, so bear with me. In terms of level 1, if you look at that, this is really telling a story about the Asia Pacific region. And it tracks all the collective regional development progress made by the development member countries in Asia Pacific. These indicators are fully aligned with SDGs, the 17 SDGs, and are tracked quite carefully on it. In terms of the levels 2 and 4, these are all at the institutional level for ADB. This is where we measure ADB's performance in executing Strategy 2030 by both setting the baselines as well as the targets for 2024. If you look at the level 2 indicators, this measures the results achieved by ADB's completed operations. It captures not only the alignment with each of the 7 operational priorities of Strategy 2030, but it also looks very carefully at the overall quality of the projects and the programs. Level 3 indicators track performance of ongoing operations. Things like design and implementation, contributions to development finance, as well as strategic alignment with Strategy 2030 priorities. The level 4 indicators measure the inputs that we put into our operations. What do we mean by this? This is how we are doing and managing our internal resources, like staffing or processes that support our operations. At the end of the day, you can see that we have a total of 60 RFIs, complemented by 156 tracking indicators. So you may ask, what do we do with all these indicators? What do we do with all the data that we collect? And in fact, this is where the development effectiveness review comes in. It comes in on an annual basis to help us assess and report on our performance in executing the corporate results framework using all the indicators that you see here. This annual review process, it's really important to us because it enables us to spot and analyze performance trends. It helps us identify underlying issues as well as develop actions for improvement. So with that, I will pass the baton back to Lindsay, who will provide you with some of the detailed insights on the development effectiveness review. Over to you, Lindsay.
Great, thanks, Lou, for that introduction. All right, so the headline finding for our 2020 review is in sum that we were able to swiftly reorient to meet our clients' COVID response needs, all while remaining aligned with our long-term strategic priorities as appropriate given the context. And by way of very quick overview, just to share that Strategy 2030 identifies 7 operational priorities. And these stem from the pressing development challenges that Asia and the Pacific face to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So as you'll see here on the slide, each of our 7 operational priorities supports the achievement of at least one SDG. And then we have SDGs 6, 7, and 9, which we consider cross-cutting and are supported by all 7 of our operational priorities. So that's the framework. And then in terms of findings from the 2020 review, overall, our level 1 indicators, which monitor regional progress, as Lou mentioned, they clearly revealed that the COVID-19 pandemic did set progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals further off track. And because new data on most of these official SDG indicators is only available every few years, our 2020 review newly made use of estimates and also projections to assess pandemic effects. So I'll highlight a few of these main findings as they relate to each of our 7 operational priorities. So first, in the red box at the top left, we saw economic growth in the region contract for the first time in more than 60 years. And millions of people are estimated to have been pushed back under the poverty line or into near poverty. Second, women's economic empowerment has been further threatened by the pandemic, with many estimates suggesting that they are at a higher risk of being pushed back into poverty, given that they already had less participation in the formal economy and have borne a higher share of the burden of unpaid care. And meanwhile, in the green box, you'll see highlighted that environmental issues also remain pressing in the region. Despite severe economic contraction, we saw that greenhouse gas emissions are estimated to have reduced by less than 7% in 2020. And more than 5,000 deaths were attributed to natural hazards in the region, adding to the toll of the pandemic. Meanwhile, cities have been at the front line of the pandemic, and here crowded conditions and the lack of access to services for all have made it difficult to contain the pandemic here. In terms of food security, 28% of children in the region were already stunted prior to the pandemic, and this is a challenge, of course, which the pandemic's effects have worsened in terms of food security issues being exacerbated. On the good governance side, we did see a slight improvement per the World Governance Indicators Index, but it's still relatively weak on the global scale and needs strengthening. And finally, while the foundations of regional cooperation are relatively strong in Asia and the Pacific, many countries did look inwards to manage the pandemic, but it's clear that renewed cooperation will be pivotal to recovery. All right, so how did we work to address these pressing issues in 2020? Our review looks both at completed and new investments to answer this question. So we have a series of indicators to assess the extent to which completed projects and programs achieved the development results that they were intending to achieve. And in 2020, we had good performance overall in achieving results for each of our 7 operational priorities. This slide highlights a few of the results, to which a total of 235 of our completed projects contributed. Now, turning to the future and our new investments going forward, our strategy includes 6 specific targets guiding ADB's investments until 2030. So by way of summary, by 2024, we're aiming to have private sector projects make up 1/3 of our total portfolio of new projects annually, a shift that Robert highlighted today at the beginning. And by 2030, we're looking to have every $1 of our own financing for private sector operations matched by $2.5 of long-term co-financing. Then by 2030, we're targeting to have at least 75% of our new projects and programs promote gender equality, and equally 75% also support climate change mitigation and adaptation. All the while, we're looking to have invested a cumulative total of 80 billion of climate financing in ADB's own funds. So what was our progress towards these 6 targets in 2020? This performance is shown by the performance signals that you'll see in the gray boxes here on the slide. To either side of that, we show the target we're looking to achieve, as well as the baseline value and performance from the previous year. So starting on the left and looking at gender, our new operations in 2020 did set a record level of gender mainstreaming. And this was really driven by the large number of COVID response operations that were gender mainstreamed in the bank. We really made an effort to ensure this. Focus on gender equality continued through our COVID support, as well as we saw good performance on our regular operations as well. So we'll need to sustain this progress, however, to be on target in 2030. And this is going to become increasingly challenging, we expect, because we're pursuing at the same time the other targets I mentioned, which is to scale up our climate change operations and also to scale up our private sector operations, or as we call them, also non-sovereign operations. So these sort of triple targets, as we consider them, are challenging to meet altogether. In the middle, on the climate front, projects teams did make a concerted effort to integrate mitigation and adaptation into COVID response operations as appropriate. And the number of our climate change operations did grow in 2020. However, these ended up forming a smaller proportion of our portfolio, which was greatly enlarged by the many health and public sector management interventions that were required to address immediate COVID response needs. So many of our COVID response operations did not have entry points for climate change, and some large climate projects did get postponed. So you'll see here from the amber signals that our progress did slow on these indicators, but they're still rated on track, but to watch. And this means for us that there is time to catch up, but to do that, we're going to need to ramp up our climate focus in the next few years, which is exactly what our pipeline is intending to do. Finally, in terms of scaling up our private sector or non-sovereign operations, we fell off track in terms of this just in 2020 alone, because the increased share of our non-sovereign operations It didn't happen since we had a big number of sovereign operations, more than usual. And these were really critical, this direct support to governments to address their COVID response needs. So as a result, we didn't manage to meet our target for 2020, but it's something that we have a fresh start on each year. And we'll look to continue focusing on in the recovery phases and thereafter. And likewise, we didn't move the needle much in terms of increasing our non-sovereign co-financing ratio last year. All right, so before I pass it over to Bernard to share about our COVID response work a little bit more in detail, I wanted to let you know quickly about a new platform that we recently launched. So Results Reality is a virtual exhibit, and it's the latest in our ongoing efforts to bring the actual lives and experiences of end beneficiaries closer to all of our other stakeholders. And it does so by combining 360-degree interactive video clips, photos, and data to show the lives of women in the community served by our gender mainstreamed water supply and sanitation projects for small towns in Nepal. So I invite you to explore this. It's online. And then we're looking forward also to when we can host the physical exhibit, which will provide a more immersive and interactive experience using augmented reality apps and virtual reality headsets. So with that, I will pass it over to Bernard to share about our COVID response. Over to you, Bernard.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. As Robert said, you can't think about 2020 and development effectiveness without thinking about COVID-19. And so in the 2020 development effectiveness review, we included a special chapter on ADB's COVID-19 response. I'd like to give you some highlights from that. I can go to the next slide. So like many other MDVs, IFIs, we came out with a response package. This was initially announced at $6 billion in May and then greatly expanded by April to $20 billion. And when you think of the MDBs as a system, a significant contribution to the total MDB response of around $230 billion for 2020 and 2021. I'll talk a little bit on the next slide about the timeline for some changes, but we made a lot of changes to streamline our processes and procedures. This really helped us to provide a quick and effective response to the pandemic. And later in the year, we brought out in 2020 vaccine financing, which is now a key part of moving towards recovery. Our response was comprehensive, covering 26 developing member countries, and we did this always working in collaboration with other development partners, WHO and the UN. So if I can go to the next slide, let me talk a little bit about the speed of the response. And I think this is particularly important because it shows how ADB was able to quickly and effectively react to the pandemic. So the story really starts on the left-hand side of the slide here with the first reports of cases of pneumonia coming out of the People's Republic of China at the end of December. Right then, none of us really knew what this was, but only 4 weeks later, by the 27th of January, ADB had begun to reorient an ongoing disease surveillance and outbreak response project in Lao PDR to provide support for what was becoming the COVID-19 pandemic. And this was 3 days before the WHO declared COVID-19 as a public health emergency of international concern. So by the time we hit 11th of March, that was the day that the WHO declared COVID-19 as a pandemic, ADB already had 7 operations underway, totaling $32.3 million and providing assistance to 40 DMCs, developing member countries. A week later, after the declaration of the pandemic on the 18th of March, of course, staff in both our headquarters in Manila and our resident missions around Asia and the Pacific, we were all shifting to remote work from home. We then announced the first package of $6.5 billion. and then started making those changes that I mentioned, streamlining our processes to better respond to the pandemic. On April 13th, those were approved along with this upsized package of $20 billion. And these included some critical guidance documents for staff on how to implement COVID-19 response operations, and also a COVID-19 policy database. So basically, we took all the responses of our member countries across Asia and the Pacific, put them in a database, and this was a great knowledge product to help with countries planning how they should respond to the pandemic. Well, I think that maybe the flagship part of the response was something called the COVID-19 Pandemic Response Option, or CPRO. So this is a budget support facility modeled on the counter-cyclical response facility that we put in place to try and combat the effects of the Asian financial crisis. So essentially, we took a model and approach from the Asian financial crisis and then repurposed that to help with COVID-19. By the 31st of May, we had 52 operations underway for a total of $6.6 billion. And then later in the year, around the 11th of December, we moved to the next stage, which was on vaccines, approving the $9 billion Asia-Pacific Vaccine Access Facility, or APVAX, bringing our total COVID-19 response package to $29 billion. So by the end of the year, at the end of 2020, we had 185 operations worth $16.3 billion, including 26 of those CPROs, or COVID-19 pandemic response options. That's the 2020 picture. Of course, that's been continued in 2021, and we've had an additional 17 vaccine access projects approved to date, totaling about $1.3 billion in financing. So as you can see from the very, very early stages, before we all really knew what was going on, ADB was already moving and then was rapidly positioned to be able to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. So being the results division, we wanted to take a look at what results are being achieved. Of course, it's early days. This programming is only a year maximum or 18 months old, but what we've done is take a look at the expected results from those CPRO operations. So we've mined all of those approval documents and pulled out and pulled together these. And you can see on this slide the quite sizable number of people, businesses, beneficiaries expected to benefit. And just to say that these CPRO operations really, thanks to interventions from European and other board members, really have a focus on women, focus on the poorest and the most vulnerable, which I think you can see coming out on this slide. Also pulling out those kind of knowledge products so that we can learn and improve the way that we respond to COVID-19. We also asked our clients. So in the latter part of the year, we had a client survey. We asked them 5 questions about our COVID-19 response: speed, the knowledge support, how tailored it is, the size versus the country needs, and the results that we've achieved on the ground. And we're very pleased to see that we have quite substantial high responses from our clients for this. So all in all, I think ADB's done a very quick and effective job in responding to the pandemic. The results look promising. Of course, we still have to see the data, and the initial feedback from our clients is also very positive. So I encourage everyone, if you haven't already, take a look at the special chapter on COVID-19 response in the 2020 Development Effectiveness Review. So to close it out, I'd like to hand over to the current director, Lou. Lou, over to you.
Thank you, Bernard. Yes, so we can move on to the next slide. In looking ahead, I wanted to share some of the key actions that we're looking at ADB to improve our performance and address the challenges as identified by the Development Effectiveness Review. So for example, we are strengthening our monitoring approach for projects during implementation to ensure that they will deliver against the projected development results at completion. We are also looking to improve the performance of our non-sovereign or private sector operations by establishing a framework that better captures the additionality and also the anticipated development results for each project at conception. We have intensified efforts to improve the sustainability of results achieved by our sovereign operations, including a comparative study that examines practices for promoting and determining sustainability across development partners. And as Lindsay has indicated earlier, we are doing well in mainstreaming gender into our project preparation. But we also want to make sure that sufficient human resources are allocated to achieve the intended gender equity results also at project completion. And last, but certainly not the least, we continue to support efforts to reach the SDGs through the implementation of our Strategy 2030. We are also deepening our engagement with our clients so that we can collectively work towards a sustainable post-COVID recovery. We can move on to the next slide. So for those of you who haven't seen the latest development effectiveness review, I would encourage you to download it. There's a lot of interesting and insightful knowledge in this publication. And with that, I will pass you back to Robert.
Well, thank you very much, Lou. And also thank you very much to colleagues from SPRA. So I think from the presentation, the picture we get is that on the whole, a lot of work was achieved. There are those amber areas, which again, it's still fine, but things like the very important climate change angle, things we need to watch. I think the bit which is off track on the co-financing, it's something we recognize very well from the European office based in Frankfurt, where we work closely with the private sector department to look at getting private finance into development. And that clearly was really hammered at the start of the pandemic. So I think this is something we recognize and we do look forward to getting picked up again, but it did have that very major impact. But without further ado, if I could turn to Annalisa from the Overseas Development Institute for your reactions to what you've heard, please. Thanks very much, Annalisa.
A big thank to you, Robert, and your team actually for bringing us together this morning. And it's also quite important after a very eventful year to take stock of the effectiveness of the operations of the ADB and other MDBs and progress made this year. And thank you for offering me the opportunity to share some reflections and to kick off the discussion. I would like to make 3 different points and reflections, mainly focusing on financing for development. The first one is around the mobilization of resources by the ADB overall at the early stages of the pandemic in comparative mode. Second, some reflections on the challenges for vaccine purchases and for UpVax. And finally, a couple of reflections on the long-term vision for the financial resources of the ADB in support to the crisis and post-crisis recovery. So first on the mobilization of resources at the early stages of the pandemic. In the past year, our analysis systematically showed that the response to the crisis of the ADB had been much stronger than the other multilateral development banks. And let me share 2 statistics to corroborate this argument. First of all, the Asian Development Bank is the only multilateral development bank whose portfolio, and I'm saying of both windows, I mean, I'm talking about concessional and non-concessional lending, grew far more now than at the time of the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009. Second point, the project approvals of concessional grants and loans grew by more than 200% between 2019 and 2020, and that's second only to IDA. However, we have a mixed picture when it comes to non-concessional lending, with overall project approval actually falling and down by 25% year on year. The figures that we're using are the project approvals from January to December, comparing 2019 and 2020. So updated figures down the line might show a rather different picture. And let me go to my second main point. I mean, we know that vaccinating the world should be the top priority for global development. That's probably one of the very few instances where national interest is very much aligned with kind of the global development interest. So the APVAX facility of 9 billion is certainly very much kind of welcome. But even if figures constantly change, and similarly to the case of the World Bank, the uptake and demand of the vaccine facilities have been, however, relatively low. There are multiple factors at play, and not all of them are actually under the remit or the control of individual MDBs. And this goes from kind of strict rules for approvals of vaccines, procurement rules, the lack of vaccine supply, and somehow at times a tendency not to borrow for vaccine purchases. We don't have the time and the space to elaborate on this point right now, but understanding the reasons why the demand for vaccine purchases is low is somehow a matter of urgency. We know the kind of scale of the challenge ahead and the financing requirements are met, especially when resources are potentially available. And let me now go to my third and final point. Bernard has showed the kind of results of the client survey. And there's one figure that really caught my attention. I mean, even though differences seem minor, there was one kind of question and that received the kind of lowest score in terms of kind of being kind of rated as excellent and good. And this is the size of the ADB's response versus the country's need. Compared to other multilateral development banks, the ADB has lending capacity available, so it's a matter of boosting it. And to a certain extent, if I can open a parenthesis, I also hope progress will be made on an external review of the capital adequacy of MDBs in the context of the G20. But let me kind of end by saying that we know that budgets of many bilateral donors are very much under pressure. So financing at below market rates from MDBs becomes even more important right now. And while the ADB might not need a general capital increase right now, it's really worth reminding how paid-in capital into MDBs remains a really good investment and good value for money for shareholder. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Annalisa, for raising some really important points there. And, maybe in the backtrack to 2020, one thing I should mention as well is the total amount that we basically committed to the DMCs actually substantially went up, as you'd expect. Typically, it would be about, the last few years, it would be about 20 billion a year. Last year was well over 30. So the question is, can you sustain it? And it has to come down at some point. For the poorest countries, one of the things that we were actually really delighted, and thank you to many around the figurative table here today, the Asian Development Fund 13 replenishment negotiations are underway and were just about to be concluded when the pandemic hit. I think the process was delayed, but we got really fantastic support from donors. And so the successful conclusion of ADF 13 really, is and will be a massive help, especially for those poorest DMCs. So it's something that we were very, very happy with. I thank you also for mentioning the APVAX, the vaccine facility. I mean, from my current European hat, we have seen in Europe, I am now glad to say double vaccinated. We're about to reopen the office. I think it's day after tomorrow. And we see Europe really reopening. Because people are getting vaccinated. But I see the situation's very, very different in many Asian developing member countries. So the need to increase the support for vaccines is really very, very strong. And at our recent, again, virtual annual meeting, our president, President Massa, he was mentioning it's not just about the money. It's even if you've got the money, can you get your hands on the vaccines? Again, are they there to be bought? How do you get them into people's arms? And this is one thing I think with ADB in general, we do look forward to working more with bilateral partners across Europe and some of the multilaterals to increase that effort. But thank you very much, Annelise, for, and as you say, of that, on the capital front, that $150 billion, which I mentioned early on, the paid in is actually really small. The last capital increase we did, I think it was about 10 years ago, it's only 2% paid in. It's a leverage function, which I think is unparalleled anyway, and actually quite little known how much one actually has to put in to actually get a huge bang for the buck in terms of impact in development further down the road. But I don't want to speak too much, and I want to turn over straight away, please, to Per for his thoughts on what we heard today. Over to you, please, Per.
Thank you so much, Robert, and thank you for asking me to comment on this very important report. So does this report meet my expectations? That's the main question I'm going to answer. And first of all, let me say that my expectations to this report is formed by 4 different factors. First of all, knowing that ADB is operating in a vast area with many different development challenges. Secondly, that ADB's understanding that ADB's purpose is to provide developing financing, both on concessional terms and on AAA financial terms. To me, this implies that the ADB is approaching risks and will likely not succeed with all operations. And thirdly, the COVID-19 pandemic has caused a particularly challenging environment for development. And fourthly, this development effectiveness report or review is one of ADB's 3 results reports. And the stated intention of this report is to assess ADB's development effectiveness, highlight actions ADB has taken to improve, and identify areas where ADB's performance needs to be strengthened. And the report is meant to guide ADB's strategic and operational directions and resource planning. But also, this is a management report. It's not an independent report. So these factors influence my expectations when reading the report. So I see some strengths and some weaknesses. First of all, I think the report is based on a very solid results framework. The 4 different levels it makes sense and is credible and realistic. And I do appreciate that there are no attempts to aggregate from one level to another level, which is unrealistic to do. I also think that one strength is that this report is closely linked with ADB's strategy. So it makes it's useful to understand how ADB is following on its strategy. It has good and credible reporting on the COVID-19 consequences for the DMCs and on how ADB has met the pandemic. And this coincides with other sources I've seen on ADB's performance. It was fast, it was sizable, and it was useful. Another strength I see with this report, well, I like the scorecard at the end and the summary report. And I also think it's very useful to get the client feedback to the COVID-19 response. these are certainly some strengths with this report. But then when it comes to the weaknesses, I think the report is maybe attempting to do too much. It's a bit too long, 130 pages, and it's a bit too comprehensive. The report includes a presentation of weaknesses and challenges, but maybe this is formulated a bit implicit and a bit hidden in the report. I'm also uncertain on how this report actually will guide ADB's strategic and operational directions and resource planning. It is only on one page, page 7, that ongoing and new challenges are being discussed. So for a conclusion, does this report meet my expectations? Well, yes, partly it does. But maybe also it's time to reconsider the format of the report. As you say in the foreword, this is report number 14 of this size, of this type. So maybe it's time now to look at the report format. Is it too comprehensive? Is it too long? Is it useful enough to guide senior management and the board? So I think I leave it that for my comments. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Per, for raising some really serious, important issues there. Maybe I can before turning to Bernard, before an initial reaction to what you've said, Per, and to Annelise's points, I can ask the participants, if you would like to come in, please do put in a question in the Q&A, and or just indicate if you'd like to come in and make an intervention. But maybe just before turning to Bernard, Per, if I can just come back on, I think, on 2 points. The guiding of the results work on the strategy. I think this has really come a long way in ADB, and of course, I think as I think everybody who will know, this is not just those 3,600 people in ADB who need to be, let's say, au fait and compliant with the results work. This is our 40 developing member countries. Ultimately, the sometimes slightly tricky bit is that you've got to take this results framework and get those roughly 40 developing member countries, the government counterparts, civil society counterparts, to buy in. So actually, this goes pretty wide and deep. And I think the big success is that now, if you go to so many of these capitals in developing countries in Asia, they are themselves using this, and it's integrated into their own policies and strategies. It also means it can be a little bit difficult to turn things around on a dime. But COVID really has asked serious questions now of 2030. And thank you for raising that, Per. For example, health. There was a SARS, there was MERS, but health does seem to get chronically neglected, and memories seem to be short. What can be different? And there are serious questions posed by this. What does that mean for Strategy 2030? Then one other aspect, and this is again from the European perspective, thank you for raising the aspect of the communications angle. And it would be interesting to hear from participants as well. ADB is pretty much a household name in Asia, because again, a lot of schools and bridges and airports and various other things actually financed by ADB. But here, despite the fact that Europe has a massive stake in ADB, as a shareholder, as a donor, as a co-financier, you name it, ADB is not that well known. And that's something I've seen very much in this current job. And ultimately what we hear all the time from capitals is, please communicate what you're doing, what you're achieving. This is the core element. This is the core report which we use for communicating. So I'd be very interested to discuss further whether this serves the needs of capitals, particularly those who are who are responsible for the IFI relations. So maybe I can turn quickly to you, Bernard, and then we can move to the Q&A and other SBRA colleagues on the initial reactions to what Annalisa and Per have said.
Thank you very much, Robert, and thank you both to Annalisa and Per for your insights. Very interesting to hear those and get a external perspective. Maybe two responses for each of them. So interesting, Annalisa. We kind of thought about our response vis-a-vis the other MDBs, and it's interesting to hear your analysis. Some new data there, and kind of supports maybe what we thought. But just to underscore, this was not a given. We really kind of broke the mold in a number of places and how we respond. And this is management, staff, the board, everybody streamlining, but also a lot of extra hours of work and really hard work from everybody. And it didn't necessarily have to go that way. So I think a lot of kudos for those who are making decisions early on and kind of guiding us in the direction. On the vaccine APVACs, totally take those points. The facility was only approved in December, so we've basically had about 6-7 months of experience. We're learning from that, and as you say, there are many external factors that are coming into play, as Robert also mentioned, with the supply of vaccines. Even if we provide the financing, can people procure them? So I think that we'll have a much better understanding of when we do the 2021 DFR and report on the experience with APVACs. It'll be very interesting to look at. Per two thoughts on your comments. Thanks for saying that about the no attempt to aggregate. We've had to argue why that wasn't the case a few times with different stakeholders. So very pleased to hear that. And we also think that's the correct thing, and we've stuck with that. Then the feed-in, this gets, I guess, more into the internal way that ADB works, but there are 3 distinct points in the kind of annual cycle. The first is the president's planning directions. So every February, the president issues instructions to the organization. These are directly informed by the initial findings of the development effectiveness review. We've also put in place something called the operational performance metrics. So this is a series of we have, of course, the corporate targets and the corporate results framework. We then cascade those to the different departments. So the gender target, each department gets a piece of that target to try and accomplish. So that operational performance metrics, the OPM, is the second part where the DFR has traction. And the third is the work program and budget framework, which comes later in the year and also takes in the findings. So I agree that's not so highlighted in the report, but in the annual cycle, the planning system within ADB, there's kind of those 3 distinct points where the results are feeding into strategic directions. Maybe I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bernard. And maybe we can answer the question that Chantal has posed. If I can read out. So the strong and quick response to the pandemic is impressive. To what extent is this flexible programming matched by agile results reporting? And what are the lessons taken? And again, Bernard, if you could field those, if you might.
Sure, maybe this one I can hand over to Lindsay to come in first.
Sure, yeah. Thanks for the question, Chantal, and good to hear from you. You mentioned agile results reporting, what are the lessons we've learned. Certainly, we're still learning them, right? We're still in the mix now. But I think to share a little bit about what we've done differently so far and what we've learned from it. Certainly, obviously, in the context of our actual projects, our typical ones, we've learned, about the importance of being very flexible in terms of our data sources and monitoring approaches, both in terms of how we go about it. So we've been needing to, and teams have actually done a great job of quickly using remote monitoring. tools and approaches, everything from drones to survey construction sites to other virtual forms of collecting information, like online surveys through phones, etc., to reach our different target beneficiaries. So, we've basically been able to be flexible fairly quickly in allowing teams to change the data sources for some of the indicators that they were looking to measure, to make sure that we get the most reliable data possible without being too burdensome for our developing member countries. And that's another point I wanted to highlight, and a big lesson learned, of course, is that we need and have needed to and continue to be making efforts to be very reasonable and careful about what we ask of our government counterparts, noting that they are busy dealing with a crisis like all of us. And that means we need to prioritize on what's critical. So that has also meant that for our COVID response operations themselves, we've been very careful about focusing only on having monitoring and data collection requests that capture the most critical few pieces of performance data, and discussing these expectations with our clients to make sure that everyone agrees that it's feasible to do. And finally, I think also important has been the introduction of rapid assessment methods themselves. So, and doing things differently. So our independent evaluation department is doing a real-time evaluation. So they're providing an independent assessment with frequent reports, but also on the management side internally for us, for staff, we've been doing more real-time monitoring at the corporate level of what's going on. And the product of that you've actually seen right now in the development effectiveness review, in terms of getting really quickly compiling and understanding what the expected results are of our projects. And then also looking at new and flexible ways to do evaluation. That's the main thing I'm working on now with our teams. So for example, looking at our general budget support that we provided to governments so that they could provide countercyclical financing. That was a unique instrument that was introduced. And we recognize now that we need to take a tailored approach to evaluating the effectiveness of these. So we're currently looking at developing new methods for doing that. So that's a few of what we learned and what we've done. I'm not sure if Bernard, do you want to add to that? Otherwise, so we're still learning like everyone else, and happy to keep engaging with folks like you in the OECD and sharing so that we can learn together.
Yeah. Also, thank you, Lindsay. No, Bernard, please.
I was just going to add two quick things. So one is in the results frameworks for these operations, understanding that we may not have all of the right indicators at the beginning. So usually where we put in the results framework indicators, we lock them in. Now we've said, okay, these are the indicators which are the best we have at this point in time. When they come to do the final evaluation, we may be able to see that it's new, we may be able to add those. So I think that level of flexibility in the individual project or operational results frameworks, not something that we really had before or used before. The second is the expected results. So typically we never report on expected results, but given the amount of resources going to COVID-19 response operations in this DFR, in this special chapter, for the first time, we're putting in expected results. So I would say those are two innovations, flexibility that we're building in, and as Lindsay said, continuing to learn. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Bernard. And I know we're scheduled to finish at in about 2 minutes, but I think it would be great if we could take Chris's question, and if you could, beg your tolerance for my not being a terribly good moderator in terms of timekeeping, but it'd be great to take that question. And if I could just add very quickly also to the point you mentioned, Lindsay, your average ADB project is not implemented by ADB. It's implemented by a government agency working with consultants, working with contractors. Actually, in the European office, we've been working very closely actually with a big Belgian company, Tractable, who have some, they're a major contractor to ADB. And they actually have really ingenious ideas how to do things remotely based on their own experience in Europe. And so with technologies and innovations, there's some really interesting things coming through. And that's also something which we're very keen to learn more of, that basically opening up the process to the private sector and all the initiatives that they take to get results in this difficult environment. But maybe we could go quickly to Chris's question from London. So the client survey was generally positive for the bank, but did it produce any useful messages on what the bank could do better? Maybe Bernard, we could start with you on that one.
Sure, maybe I'd highlight one message. So interestingly, from our direct clients' point of view, so these are our governments, implementing agencies, executing agents, we asked them, how well do we work with you? And they scored us very highly. But we also asked them, how well do we work with other development partners at the country level? And they scored us relatively lower, so on the lowest scores in the survey. So I think this is a clear indication of an area we need to take a look at and see where we can improve is country level collaboration, whether that's with other bilaterals, multilaterals, non-governmental organizations, academia need to do a better job of collaborating with them. So the government direct counterpart relationship quite strong, but the relationship with other members of the development community is something we need to work on.
So thank you very much, Bernard. And I think as we're slightly over the finishing time, and we actually were planning to play a video as well. But maybe I think as various people I think have other commitments. Maybe what I can do already is just thank everybody for participating. Particular thanks, of course, to Per and to Annalisa for coming in and really raising some really serious important issues, which I think we have the core team here who will take these very much to heart. Thank you to participants for the questions, and maybe I can again say thank you for attending, and understand if you need to go, but I think if we could move to that video to close, and if you have time, please do watch it. But for the time being, thanks again, and it was great that you could join us today.